Could you imagine a rocket launching from here? From right here, in this glorified parking lot? Well, this is what the first launch pad that I ever set foot on looked like when I joined in the summer of 2012. And you might not know a lot about launch sites, but I have a feeling that you understand that there is nothing going on here. There's a little hole in the ground to shoot fire into, but there's not much else. And yet, here's that same pad, just over a year later. I took this photo about 1 a.m., the morning the first launch took off. And so a question that I want to pose to you is, what does it take to turn a parking lot into a launch site in a year? When I started on that launch site, most of our team was fresh out of school. We didn't know how to build a launch site. We were just young engineers, we were eager to learn, and we were eager to work. And so while you're mulling that, I have another one for you. Could you imagine building a barge and taking it out to sea to try to land the first stage of that same rocket? Where would you even start? Well, the details of that are a very long story, but suffice to say that a few months after we started, we towed it out to its first mission. And yeah, maybe you could imagine what happened next. The barge blew up, like a lot. And so obviously there were some growing pains with this one. We had to rebuild a few times. But still, it's worth posing the question. What does it take to turn a shipping barge into a landing platform? We didn't know anything about landing rockets at sea, but in this case, luckily, no one did. It had never been done before. It wasn't something you could just like Google and figure out and piece together. So how did we know what to do? Well, we didn't. You saw that rocket blowing up after all. So maybe then a better question is, if we didn't know, how did we figure it out? Well, we had a missing piece that a lot of other people lacked, and that piece is imagination. And you might be thinking, really? But yes, seriously. In the years since, I have found that having a strong, practical imagination is often what separates teams between success and failure. And yes, I grant you, imagination alone is not enough. You can't close your eyes and picture the moon and show up there, right? I was on a team of badass engineers and technicians, and that really just goes without saying. Because what I mean is that there are nearly endless, brilliant people in this world, but they're often self-limited in their thinking about what can be done or what is even possible. We are the limitation in a world of often limitless possibility. Our aperture just is not wide enough. That launch site I showed you before, the one that started out looking like an old parking lot, that required a ton of practical imagination each day. If we had just shown up, done the bare minimum, and not been fully engaged, we would have been dead in the water. You have to imagine what it will be like when a rocket that you have never seen, and which is still being built, finally shows up. How are you going to launch it? Hell, how are you going to roll it to the pad? Fun fact, see that giant thing on wheels in the background? And see that gentle curve in the road? Those back wheels don't turn, my friends. They have to skid around corners. And not to weigh you down with technical detail, but this thing weighs nearly 1 million pounds. So frankly, we don't know if it'll do it. And you can tell during this first operation where we're trying to find out how it's going by the look on everyone's face. They watch it slowly roll forward. We've got the guy in the background squatting, nervously watching the tires. We've got the guy with his hands in his pockets, looking a little morose. We had to realize that grand imagination alone wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to say, we're going to launch a rocket. We had to get practical. We had to test things. We had to figure out how to get them done. So multiply simple oversights like that across dozens of systems, hundreds of times, and you can see where things could kind of go off track, if you'll forgive my pun. Because as you can see, practical imagination is not pretty. Well, with the exception of my friend Dick Gill and his beautiful hard hat there. On a launch site like that, imagination is one thing, but you almost had to be prophetic to be effective designing the landing barge. Some days, I really didn't even believe we were going to do it. And you might be wondering why I'm showing you these examples, but I really believe that it's important to see things like this behind the scenes in the imperfect way in which they come together. Because like I said, practical imagination is not pretty. When it comes to changing an industry, or maybe even changing the world, it requires being in the dirt, hands-on, seeing the forest and seeing the trees at the same time. Because of course, while there may be no limit to your grand imagination, clicking your heels together and going to the moon, there are limits to what you're able to practically imagine. And by that I mean, though you can close your eyes and picture anything, it's a lot harder to make that thing real. It's hard to really believe it. And the welders here, they didn't believe that we were going to land a rocket on this thing. I didn't have this perspective when I was sweating in the shipyard. But looking back, I realized that when we talk about practical imagination, we're really talking about the intersection of two things: passion and opportunity. With that barge example, we were ignited by our passion for building new things and reaching a little bit further to do something new. And once that intersected with the opportunity to do it, we got to employ our practical imagination to make it real. This overlap is an amazing place to be. You start thinking about what could happen, what could become possible, and how the world around you can change rather than just being mired in all what already exists. And I really believe that that's powerful. I've been fortunate to be there a few different times and in a few different ways, and I have 3 lessons to share with you that I've learned along the way. The first lesson: don't get lost in fantasy. Oh man, it's fun to dream. I love it. I love the little dopamine hit I get when I picture some amazing future that's not yet come to pass and probably never will. This is what I was talking about with grand imagination. And simply, it's fantasy. Hitting a game-winning three-pointer in the NBA playoffs was my version of that as a kid. I wanted to be on the dream team, right? But as much as I dreamed it, it just wasn't coming true. We have to meet life where it's at and then show up and do the work from there. The example from my adult life was my first company. When I started, I was eating sandwiches out of a cooler from the back of my Jeep, sleeping on an air mattress. One day, a few months into it, I woke up on that air mattress, and I just had myself a nice little hissy fit. Why couldn't anybody see our potential? Why was nobody buying into the thing we were building? If I may exercise another pun, why wasn't this taking off? Suddenly, I realized it was up to me to make the moves. It wasn't just going to happen on its own. You see, I'd become lost in the fantasy of what I wanted my experience of entrepreneurship to be. And for a bootstrap company, man, that's dangerous. Like any survival situation, you really have to take stock of where you're at, what you have, and then take action from there. It's not some passive daydream. If you're in a tough situation, having pleasant daydreams, following a random path of footsteps and circles, that's not practical imagination, my friends. That's hypothermia. So don't end up frozen in place, out of options, and burned out on actionless dopamine hits. Second lesson: don't build the wrong thing. Awesome, right? Easier said than done. What's the wrong thing? Well, great question. The wrong thing is anything that does not serve you. Whether that's because it doesn't pay the rent, or it's because it's not your true calling. Opportunities are ugly when they come our way. They're half-formed, they're nebulous. They're usually more reason not to do it than to do it, right? At best, they're an invitation to hard work with no promise or guarantee of any kind of payoff for the effort that you're about to put in. And there's a million opportunities out there. How are you supposed to know what to chase? So let's say that you always wanted to build an app that made it big. You pitched idea after idea to any VC that would listen to you, just to reach your perceived goal of making it big, running a tech company. Now, it's 3 a.m., and you're in a server room trying to get your app, Tinder for Dogs, back online. And people are burning your ass on Twitter. Oh, they are furious that Kenai or Denali or Luna, they can't get the hookup. And you're exhausted, because before the middle of this night call, you spent all day in meetings trying to decide if you should expand into wearable accessories that let their little paws work on the screen. How in the hell did you end up here? This is not what you wanted. The way we can avoid chasing opportunities that don't fit us is by practicing discernment. Simply ask, is this depleting me or renewing me? Act accordingly. Then ask that question again, constantly, forever. Put another way, trust your gut. I used to call it turning towards the light. Learn to talk to yourself and then act on what you hear yourself saying back. Because only you can decide what is a real opportunity worth pursuing and what isn't. Your friends can't decide, your partner can't decide, your mama can't decide, only you, which is great news. Because you see, imagination is also not static. Passions and opportunities evolve. They grow with us as we grow. What may be the right thing to build today can be wrong tomorrow, and that's okay. I loved the projects I got to work on and the people I worked with in my 20s at the big space company. But in my case, ultimately working there was not renewing. It just depleted me. And I initially found it really strange that I woke up 1,000 times happier after I left and started working on my own thing, even when I was broke and couch surfing, all hissy fits aside. And you know, that's usually a pretty strong sign. We change our goals as the seasons of life change. Sometimes the hope, the dream, the opportunity you're chasing now is just a vector to get you onto some other truer, better path. And when that happens, don't give up, but definitely quit. My mantra for the last 6 years has been raise the child, though last year that was amended to raise the children. My original goal, build cool companies in Alaska, shifted to this new mandate. In short, I had to get practical to survive. A couple years into that first business, it was clear it wasn't working. In fact, I was keeping it afloat by consulting to space companies on the side. So I decided just to do that full time. Real business genius stuff right there, let me tell you. But when I finally gave up being lost in fantasy, I was able to practically reimagine my life, and I was able to build the right thing by focusing on a much more important, bigger goal. I quit what I was doing, but I didn't give up. In the end, I surrendered. I put my ego aside and I quit striving. I realized that I was both building the wrong thing and lost in fantasy while doing it. The world simply wasn't reflecting back what I was putting out there. Because look, your conception of your wildest dreams is not going to come true. And that's good, because even if they did, they would look so different into reality as to be unrecognizable to you. But guess what? If you can let go, something wilder, more nuanced, more beautiful than you can imagine is awaiting you. And whatever that is, will be different for all of us. For me, it's a chance to build new things here in Alaska, a place that I love, to expand what is seen as possible. I think most of us agree that Alaska is an amazing place, but it's also one that we all seem to have pigeonholed on to what it can or even is allowed to be. But it can be anything. We can be anything. Hell, we sent things to space from right there. The change in our perspective, though, takes many, many tiny steps, and it takes people working together along the way. But trust me, extraordinary things happen in otherwise very ordinary places. They happen here, on a sleepy coast where you convert that old parking lot into a launch site. Or they happen here, in a dirt shipyard on the banks of the Atchafalaya at the end of the Mississippi where we built the barges. Opportunity is everywhere. There is nothing special in the water in other places that make them hotbeds for innovation. Because I've been out there. I've been way out there. And what sets apart special movements from ordinary ones is simply that people believe that things can be different. And they imagine it in a real and practical way, and then they work towards it. And we can do that here too. So whatever you're working on, try to keep these lessons in mind. Don't get lost in fantasy. Don't build the wrong thing. And don't quit. And quit, but don't give up. Important distinction. So if that's too much to remember, try thinking about them this way instead. Stay present, drop your ego, and never, ever give up. Because after all, you don't know what you don't know when it comes to applying the limits of your practical imagination.